From ancient fortress to timeless capital, Edinburgh's story unfolds over 2,000 years, a saga of warriors and scholars forging a nation's enduring spirit.
350 million years ago, long before any human being walked the earth, a volcano forced its way through ancient rock in what would eventually become the eastern lowlands of Scotland. The eruption itself lasted perhaps thousands of years, building a mass of hard igneous rock, basalt and dolerite, that proved far more resistant to erosion than the softer sedimentary stone surrounding it. Over subsequent millions of years, as glaciers moved across Scotland during successive ice ages with grinding, irresistible force, they wore away the softer rock on every side, while the harder volcanic core stubbornly resisted, leaving behind a dramatically isolated crag rising above the surrounding landscape like a natural fortress placed there by geological accident. This formation, the volcanic plug we now call Castle Rock, provided a combination of natural advantages that no military architect could have designed more deliberately. Sheer cliff faces dropping away on three sides, a single manageable approach from the east, and commanding views extending across the surrounding landscape for miles in every direction. Any community occupying this rock could see threats approaching from extraordinary distances while presenting potential attackers with almost insurmountable defensive challenges. The same geology that made Castle Rock virtually impregnable also made it visible from enormous distances, a landmark so distinctive it could not help but accumulate symbolic significance alongside its practical military value. Millions of years after the volcano fell silent, the first human beings who looked up at this dramatic formation understood immediately what it offered. The first settlers were arriving. Archaeological evidence suggests that human communities were occupying Castle Rock and its surrounding landscape as far back as the Bronze Age, drawn by the same natural defensive advantages that would make this location strategically significant throughout every subsequent period of Scottish history. Celtic peoples, arriving during the Iron Age and establishing themselves throughout the region known as Yr Hen Ogledd, the Old North, constructed hill forts on commanding elevated positions throughout the landscape, and Castle Rock provided perhaps the most naturally defensible position anywhere in the eastern lowlands. The community that archaeology associates with this site, connected to a people the Romans called the Votadini, established their principal stronghold here, creating a fortified settlement whose exact character is difficult to reconstruct precisely from surviving evidence, but whose general nature is clear: a defended community of significant regional importance, occupying an almost uniquely advantageous position. The name that ancient sources associate with this location, Din Aden, meaning something like Fortress of the Slope in the Old Brittonic language spoken by its inhabitants, survives in transformed form within the modern name Edinburgh itself, one of the most direct and tangible connections between contemporary Scotland and its ancient Celtic past. These early communities understood the rock's value, even if they could not have imagined the extraordinary centuries of history that would eventually unfold upon and around the volcanic formation their ancestors had chosen as their most defensible home. Powerful kingdoms were emerging throughout the region that would test this community's ability to hold their remarkable stronghold. The early medieval period brought dramatic political reorganization throughout northern Britain, as different kingdoms competed for territorial control across a landscape that Roman withdrawal had left without any organizing political authority. The stronghold on Castle Rock passed through various kingdoms' control during these turbulent centuries, including periods of Northumbrian English authority before eventually coming firmly within the orbit of the emerging Kingdom of Scotland under its early kings. Malcolm II's victory at the Battle of Carham in 1018 is traditionally considered a crucial moment in establishing Scottish authority over the Lothian region where Edinburgh sat, effectively fixing the political boundary between Scotland and England, roughly where it remains today. Edinburgh's geographic position, sitting at the eastern end of the central belt that crosses Scotland between its highland and southern upland mountain ranges, with relatively direct access to the sea through the Firth of Forth, made it an obvious focus for royal attention and investment. The settlement that gradually accumulated around the base of Castle Rock during these early centuries was not yet a major urban center by European standards, but it was becoming recognizably more than a simple military garrison, with a developing church presence, growing commercial activity along the routes leading to the castle, and the kinds of specialized crafts and services that royal and military patronage consistently generate around fortified royal centers. A capital was beginning to emerge from what had been simply a fortress. Invaders, however, were approaching who would test every defensive advantage Edinburgh's geology provided. The Viking Age brought sustained pressure to virtually every coastal
Row
and
for glory! They
throughout the British
approach!
Isles, and
Prepare for
Scotland's
impact!
eastern lowlands,
Hold the line!
accessible from the North Sea and the Firth of
Odin awaits!
were not exempt from raids that could appear with terrifying speed from longships capable of covering enormous distances without warning. Scandinavian influence throughout Scotland was pervasive and complicated during this period, ranging from devastating coastal raids to longer-term Norse settlement throughout the northern and western islands that permanently shaped Scottish cultural and linguistic character. Edinburgh's inland position and the natural defensibility of Castle Rock provided meaningful protection against the kind of swift seaborne raid that devastated more exposed coastal settlements. Though the broader instability of the Viking Age affected trade networks, agricultural communities, and political alliances throughout the region in ways that inevitably influenced Edinburgh's development. The various kingdoms competing for authority throughout northern Britain during this period occasionally formed alliances with Norse powers and occasionally fought them, creating a complex, shifting political landscape in which Edinburgh's castle changed hands multiple times as different dynasties asserted or lost control over this critical stronghold. Each change of political control brought new investment in the castle's defenses, each ruler recognizing that control of Edinburgh Castle meant control of a strategically invaluable position whose loss to rivals would be a serious setback regardless of other territorial holdings. Through raid, war, and political negotiation, the castle grew progressively stronger, more elaborate, and more clearly essential to whoever aspired to govern Scotland's eastern heartland. The struggle for Scotland itself was about to begin in earnest. By the 12th century, under the patronage of Scotland's medieval kings, particularly David I, who transformed the Scottish kingdom along Anglo-Norman lines during his reign from 1124 to 1153, Edinburgh Castle had developed from an ancient hill fort into a genuine royal stronghold of considerable sophistication. David I established a castle chapel dedicated to his mother, St. Margaret, whose simple Romanesque structure still stands within the castle complex today, making it arguably the oldest surviving building in Edinburgh and one of the oldest in Scotland. Royal investment in castle infrastructure during this period reflected Edinburgh's growing importance within the Scottish kingdom's political geography, as kings increasingly recognized the strategic value of maintaining a strong, well-provisioned fortress in this central location. The town developing along the ridge descending eastward from the castle received its royal burgh charter, establishing formal commercial rights and privileges that would shape its economic development throughout subsequent centuries. Edinburgh was not yet undisputedly Scotland's capital city. Medieval Scottish kings moved between multiple royal residences, and the ancient ecclesiastical capital of Scotland was at St. Andrews in Fife. But its combination of defensive strength, commercial potential, and royal favor was steadily elevating its status above competing Scottish towns. The Great Hall, defensive towers, and garrison buildings that gradually filled the castle's summit created a royal residence of increasing magnificence alongside its continuing military function. Who controlled this castle effectively controlled Scotland's most important strategic asset. The struggle to possess and hold it would define Scottish history for generations. The struggle for Scotland was about to begin. The Wars of Scottish Independence, beginning with Edward I of England's assertion of overlordship over Scotland in the 1290s, placed Edinburgh Castle at the absolute center of one of medieval Europe's most dramatic struggles for national sovereignty. Edward's forces captured Edinburgh Castle in 1296, installing an English garrison in Scotland's most strategically valuable fortification as part of his systematic attempt to incorporate the Northern Kingdom into English rule. The resistance that followed, associated above all with the names of William Wallace and Robert Bruce, repeatedly focused on Edinburgh Castle as a symbol and military objective, whose control had profound practical and psychological implications.
Careful
for
with
both
that iron,
sides.
it's hot.
Aye,
One of
I
the
know.
most
It's
celebrated
shaping well.
episodes of this
I'm
conflict
winning. Come
involved the
on.
recapture of
Keep up
Edinburgh
now, we're
Castle in
almost there.
1314 by Thomas Randolph, Earl of Moray, whose small force scaled the supposedly unclimbable north face of Castle Rock in a night operation of remarkable daring, catching the English garrison completely by surprise. Robert Bruce's subsequent order to destroy much of the castle's infrastructure, denying English forces a defensible base they might reoccupy, demonstrated his understanding that Scotland's long-term security required strategic thinking that sometimes meant destroying what Scots most valued rather than allowing it to serve enemy purposes. The Wars of Independence forged Scottish national identity in ways that continued resonating throughout every subsequent century of Scottish history, and Edinburgh Castle stood permanently at the center of that formative national experience. Victory had been won
Onward to the
enormous
castle!
cost, but victory brought its own complex challenges. Following
The
Wars of
sun sets on our
Independence and the
triumph.
consolidation of Scottish royal authority, Edinburgh gradually and definitively emerged as Scotland's capital city, its position reflecting both geographic logic and accumulated historical association that made alternative arrangements increasingly difficult to justify. The Scottish Parliament began meeting with increasing regularity in Edinburgh, and the institutions of royal government, the Treasury, the Chancellery, the law courts, established permanent bases in and around the city that institutionalized its capital status in practical administrative terms. The construction of the Parliament House during the 17th century gave Scotland's legislative
realm
body
awaits
its
our
own
resolve.
dedicated building, adjacent
Let
to the
none
great medieval
falter
church
in their
of St.
duty.
Giles, physically anchoring the institutions of national governance within the historic urban core that had developed along the ridge between Castle and what would eventually become Holyrood Palace. Edinburgh's status as the nation's legal, commercial, and governmental center attracted the kind of concentrated investment in churches, charitable institutions, and commercial infrastructure that distinguished genuine capitals from other large towns. Guild organizations regulated Edinburgh's commercial life, controlling quality and pricing in trades ranging from baking to goldsmithing, while the city's merchants developed trading relationships with continental European partners that made Edinburgh part of a wider North Sea and Baltic commercial world. The physical city was growing denser, taller, and more complex, with the characteristic multi-story tenements called lands rising to remarkable heights along the principal street descending from the castle. The Royal Mile, that extraordinary canyon of history connecting castle to palace, was coming vividly to life. The Royal Mile, the sequence of streets running from Castle Esplanade down through the Lawn Market, the High Street, and the Canongate to Holyrood, was not merely a road in medieval Edinburgh. It was the living spine of the city, concentrating within its length, and the narrow closes and wynds branching off it, almost everything that made Edinburgh function as a society. The great tenement buildings, some reaching heights of 10 or more stories, housed populations of extraordinary social diversity within their vertical layers, with wealthier residents occupying middle floors, while those of more modest means lived in upper or basement apartments. Within the closes, those narrow, often dark passages cutting between the main street and the buildings behind, tradespeople, craftsmen, lawyers, physicians, and ordinary families lived in close physical proximity to one another, in conditions that would strike modern observers as cramped beyond endurance, but that medieval Edinburghers apparently navigated with pragmatic acceptance. The street itself was noisy, malodorous, and vibrant with commercial activity throughout daylight hours, as vendors, traders, lawyers arguing cases at nearby courts, and residents going about their daily business created the constant, energetic confusion characteristic of medieval urban life at its most densely packed. Below the surface of this busy daily life, The underground vaults beneath South Bridge and other structures preserved entire layers of Edinburgh's history, spaces used for storage, commerce, and habitation that eventually became among the city's most atmospheric historical curiosities. Down at the mile's eastern end, a palace was rising that would change everything about royal life in Scotland. Holyrood Palace grew from the guest house of the Augustinian Abbey founded by David Thirst in 1128, gradually developing across subsequent centuries into a genuine royal palace that complemented the castle at the opposite end of the Royal Mile by providing a more comfortable, less purely military royal residence, appropriate for peacetime court life. James IV began significant palace construction in the early 16th century, and James V continued this work, creating a building that reflected Renaissance architectural influence and royal ambitions for a Scottish court that could compare favorably with the sophisticated courts of France and England, with which Scotland maintained complex dynastic and diplomatic relationships. Mary, Queen of Scots, spent some of the most dramatic years of her turbulent reign at Holyrood, and the palace became the setting for events of profound historical significance, including the murder of her private secretary David Rizzio in 1566, in circumstances that exposed the violent political pressures bearing down on Scotland's young queen. The palace's connection to Mary, Queen of Scots gave it a romantic, tragic historical resonance that captured imaginations across subsequent centuries, making it a focus of historical curiosity and literary inspiration entirely disproportionate to its architectural significance alone. Holyrood represented something the castle, for all its military magnificence, could not quite provide. A place where Scotland's monarchy participated in European Renaissance culture as a civilized court rather than simply a military command center. Yet the peace that palace life suggested was always fragile in 16th century Scotland. Religious conflict was gathering energy that would transform everything about how Edinburgh understood itself. The Protestant Reformation arrived in Scotland with particular ferocity during the 1550s and 1560s, driven by the powerful preaching of John Knox and the political circumstances of a kingdom where religious allegiance had become thoroughly entangled with dynastic and foreign policy complications. Knox, who had spent years in Protestant exile in Geneva, absorbing Calvinist theology under John Calvin himself, returned to Scotland with convictions he expressed with extraordinary rhetorical force, drawing crowds to his sermons and building a reform movement that challenged not only Catholic doctrine but the entire social and political structure organized around the pre-Reformation Church. Edinburgh experienced the Reformation's physical consequences when reforming crowds attacked monasteries and church furnishings throughout the city, destroying the visual culture of medieval Catholicism with an iconoclastic thoroughness that permanently altered the character of Scottish religious life. The great church of St. Giles on the High Street, which had been Edinburgh's principal collegiate church throughout the medieval period, became the principal venue for Knox's preaching and eventually the mother church of Scottish Presbyterianism, its medieval fabric stripped of the statues, paintings, and furnishings that Catholic worship had accumulated over centuries. These religious transformations had profound political dimensions, connecting Edinburgh's internal religious conflicts to the wider struggle between Protestant and Catholic powers throughout 16th century Europe, and ultimately contributing to the circumstances that would bring the Scottish and English crowns together under James VI and Wythe in 1603. From these turbulent decades of religious conflict, a city was being prepared for one of the most remarkable intellectual flowerings in European history. During the 18th century, Edinburgh experienced an intellectual transformation so extraordinary that contemporaries and subsequent historians alike have searched for adequate language to describe its scope and significance. The Scottish Enlightenment, the collective term for the explosion of philosophical, scientific, economic, historical, and literary achievement produced by Edinburgh and the broader Scottish intellectual community during this period, contributed ideas that shaped the modern world in ways that its small geographic origins make genuinely astonishing to contemplate. David Hume, whose philosophical skepticism and rigorous empirical approach to human understanding made him one of the most important philosophers in the entire Western tradition, lived and worked in Edinburgh. His presence attracting intellectual visitors from throughout Europe who came specifically to engage with his ideas. Adam Smith, whose Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, effectively founded modern economics, developed his thinking partly through his connections with Edinburgh's intellectual community. Joseph Black contributed foundational discoveries in chemistry. James Hutton developed the science of geology through observations of Scottish landscapes that revealed Earth's unimaginable antiquity. These and dozens of other figures created a concentration of intellectual achievement within a single city during a single century that has rarely, if ever, been matched anywhere in the world. Edinburgh's medical school, the University of Edinburgh's various faculties, the literary and philosophical societies that provided formal gathering places for this remarkable community, all contributed to an environment where ideas generated extraordinary ideas, where one brilliant mind consistently encountered and was sharpened by others. Knowledge was becoming Edinburgh's greatest strength, and the city was physically expanding to express this new confidence. By the mid-18th century, Edinburgh faced a problem that its medieval geography had made essentially inevitable. The city had run out of room to grow within its ancient confines. The Old Town Ridge, already packed with the tallest residential buildings in Europe, could expand no further upward or sideways without either demolishing existing structures or building over the steep valley slopes that bounded the medieval urban core on both sides. The solution proposed by a young architect named James Craig in 1766 was audacious in its simplicity and transformative in its implications. Drain the Nor Loch, the stagnant body of water lying between the old town and the higher ground to the north. Build a bridge across the drained valley, and lay out an entirely new planned city on the broad, flat ground beyond. The new town that emerged from Craig's plan and subsequent development throughout the late 18th and early 19th centuries became one of the finest achievements of Georgian urban planning anywhere in Europe. Its broad, straight streets, elegant terraces, organized garden squares, and consistent architectural language, creating a built environment of extraordinary spatial quality and aesthetic coherence. Charlotte Square, designed by Robert Adam as the new town's western terminus, represents perhaps the finest example of Georgian civic architecture in Britain, its unified facades creating a formal urban space of measured magnificence. The contrast between the organic, medieval complexity of the old town and the rational, classical order of the new town created the distinctive dual character that UNESCO would eventually recognize as one of the world's outstanding examples of urban heritage. Industry was changing Scotland around Edinburgh, even as the city preserved this remarkable character. The Industrial Revolution that transformed so much of 19th century Scotland centered primarily in Glasgow and the Western Lowlands, where coal, iron, and the Clyde's shipbuilding potential created industrial concentrations of global significance. Edinburgh, lacking the immediate raw material resources that powered heavy industry, developed a different but equally distinctive Victorian character. Its economy built around banking, insurance, legal services, publishing, brewing, and the kinds of professional and commercial activities that a capital city naturally accumulated. The railways arrived in Edinburgh during the 1840s, their infrastructure cutting through the landscape south of the old town in ways that irreversibly altered the geography of the area around Princes Street and created new connections linking Edinburgh to the national network that was simultaneously transforming British economic and social geography. Victorian Edinburgh expanded substantially through the development of residential suburbs to the south and west, the Morningside, Bruntsfield, and Marchmont neighborhoods taking shape during this period, with tenement and villa development that accommodated the growing middle-class population drawn to Edinburgh's professional economy. The Old Town, meanwhile, experienced the social transformation characteristic of many Victorian cities, its ancient closes and tenements becoming increasingly associated with poverty and overcrowding as wealthier residents relocated to the new town and Victorian suburbs. leaving the medieval fabric occupied by the city's poorest populations in conditions that social reformers documented with growing alarm. Edinburgh's identity was becoming more complex, its social geography more stratified. But even as industry reshaped Scotland around it, Edinburgh was quietly developing a cultural character that would eventually make it unique among European cities. Culture was becoming Edinburgh's greatest treasure. Few cities of comparable size anywhere in the world have produced a literary tradition as rich and internationally influential as Edinburgh's, and the writers associated with the city span a remarkable range of periods, genres, and global reputations. Sir Walter Scott, whose historical novels essentially invented a new literary form that influenced writers throughout the world, and whose romantic vision of Scotland shaped how generations of readers imagined the country, was profoundly Edinburgh-formed, his legal career and social life embedded within the city's professional community. Robert Louis Stevenson, born in Edinburgh's New Town in 1850, absorbed the dual character of a city where Georgian respectability and Old Town mystery existed within walking distance of each other, an experience that fed directly into the divided psychologies of his greatest fiction, including the Jekyll and Hyde story, whose thematic heart owes something direct to Edinburgh's architectural and social contrasts. Arthur Conan Doyle studied medicine at the University of Edinburgh, where his professor Joseph Bell's legendary powers of observation provided the direct inspiration for Sherlock Holmes, making Edinburgh's medical school an unlikely contributor to one of popular fiction's most enduring characters. These and many other writers, from James Hogg to Muriel Spark to Ian Rankin in our own era, found in Edinburgh a city whose geography, history, and social complexity provided inexhaustible material for the literary imagination. The world was beginning to notice something remarkable about this city's creative energy. And then an event occurred that would make that creative energy visible to the entire world in an entirely new way. In 1947, a group of arts organizers had an idea that seemed modest in origin, but proved transformative in consequence. Establish an international arts festival in Edinburgh during the late summer, bringing together the finest performing arts companies from throughout the world in a city whose architecture, history, and atmosphere seemed designed by nature and history to host exactly such an occasion. The Edinburgh International Festival, launched in that first post-war year, partly as an act of cultural optimism after the devastation of the Second World War, immediately attracted attention beyond what its organizers had dared hope, drawing performers, critics, and audiences from throughout Europe and beyond to a city that discovered it had been waiting for exactly this purpose. Almost simultaneously, a parallel phenomenon emerged. Performers who had not been invited to the official festival began presenting their own work in makeshift venues throughout the city, creating the Fringe Festival, whose anarchic energy and commitment to artistic experimentation would eventually grow into the largest arts festival anywhere on Earth, overwhelming the city each August with a creative explosion that seems to defy rational explanation given Edinburgh's relatively modest size. The festivals transformed Edinburgh's international identity, demonstrating that a city whose industrial and economic significance was modest by British standards could achieve global cultural influence of the first order through the combination of its extraordinary built environment, its intellectual traditions, and the artistic programming that both official and fringe festivals consistently delivered. Ancient streets were meeting a thoroughly modern future through the medium of art. Science and education were simultaneously reinforcing Edinburgh's international reputation from a different direction entirely. The University of Edinburgh, founded in 1583 and developed throughout subsequent centuries into one of the world's genuinely great research universities, has contributed to scientific and intellectual advancement in fields ranging from medicine and surgery to physics, engineering, and computing, in ways that consistently exceed what its Scottish location might suggest to those unfamiliar with Edinburgh's remarkable intellectual traditions. Edinburgh's medical school, throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, was widely considered the finest in the English-speaking world, attracting students from Britain, America, and throughout Europe, who came specifically for training unavailable at comparable quality elsewhere. The discoveries made by Edinburgh-trained or Edinburgh-based physicians and scientists, James Young Simpson's demonstration of chloroform as an anesthetic, Joseph Lister's development of antiseptic surgical technique, James Clerk Maxwell's fundamental contributions to electromagnetic theory, represent achievements of global significance produced by an institution embedded within a city that consistently proved capable of attracting and nurturing exceptional minds. More recently, Edinburgh's Roslin Institute achieved global scientific attention through the cloning of Dolly the sheep in 1996, a breakthrough whose implications for biological science and medical research continue developing decades after the original announcement. The university's multiple campuses, scattered throughout Edinburgh's various neighborhoods, make it a genuinely integrated presence within the city's daily life, rather than an isolated academic enclave, with its teaching hospitals, research facilities, and student population contributing substantially to Edinburgh's contemporary character and economic vitality. Edinburgh was constantly evolving, its ancient skyline now meeting a future built on knowledge. The city keeps changing while somehow remaining itself. Contemporary Edinburgh presents a fascinating layering of historical periods coexisting within a single functioning city in ways that most urban environments have either never achieved or have long since destroyed through insensitive redevelopment. The medieval closes and tenements of the Old Town, their ancient fabric preserved partly through economic accident and partly through increasingly deliberate conservation policy, continue providing the bones of a neighborhood where 21st century residents and tourists move through spaces essentially unchanged in their physical configuration since the 16th or 17th centuries. The Georgian New Town, comprehensively intact in ways that few planned districts of comparable age anywhere in Europe can claim, continues functioning as a desirable residential and professional district whose architectural quality attracts the kind of long-term investment that sustains rather than destroys historic fabric. Edinburgh Castle remains an inhabited working military installation, as well as Scotland's most visited tourist attraction, its permanent garrison maintaining a living connection between the ancient fortress function that first justified the site's occupation and the contemporary Scottish nation it symbolically represents. The Scottish Parliament building, completed in 2004 to a design by the Catalan architect Enric Morales that generated enormous controversy regarding both its aesthetics and cost, sits at the foot of the Royal Mile, directly opposite Holyrood Palace, physically embedding Scotland's devolved legislative institution within the historic landscape that has always defined Edinburgh's political significance. New residential development, tramlines, cultural institutions, and commercial buildings continue adding layers to a city that has never stopped evolving. Can Edinburgh preserve this past while building its future? The city's history suggests the answer is yes. In 1995, UNESCO inscribed Edinburgh's old and new towns on the World Heritage List, recognizing in formal international terms what visitors and residents had long understood intuitively, that Edinburgh represents an exceptional example of urban heritage whose combination of medieval organic complexity and Georgian planned regularity constitutes a unique achievement in the history of human settlement. The World Heritage designation placed Edinburgh within a global community of exceptional sites that includes the Taj Mahal, the Pyramids of Giza, and the historic centers of Rome and Prague, an honor that reflected genuine international consensus about the city's outstanding universal value. This recognition carried practical implications alongside its symbolic significance, providing Edinburgh with additional tools for managing development pressures that might otherwise compromise the historic fabric, whose preservation had required sustained effort and occasional difficult decisions throughout the preceding decades. The designation also positioned Edinburgh within international tourism networks that made the city a destination for visitors from throughout the world, seeking the particular combination of historical atmosphere, cultural programming, and natural landscape setting that Edinburgh provides in unusual abundance. Yet UNESCO recognition also raised questions that Edinburgh's planners and citizens continue debating. How does a living city preserve its heritage without becoming a museum? How does authentic contemporary urban life coexist with historical preservation requirements that necessarily constrain certain kinds of change? These questions have no simple answers, and Edinburgh's ongoing attempt to navigate them honestly and thoughtfully represents one of the most interesting urban governance challenges of the contemporary world. The city's story is genuinely larger than Scotland alone. Behind every cathedral, every castle wall, every elegant Georgian terrace, and every celebrated intellectual achievement in Edinburgh's long history stand the individual human beings whose lives, ambitions, struggles, and daily work actually constitute the substance of what we call the city's story. The medieval craftspeople who cut and laid the stone of Edinburgh Castle's walls, whose names no document preserved, whose contributions the castle itself bears silent witness to across 7 centuries. The women who carried water up the steep closes of the old town in the 16th century, whose unrecorded labor sustained households within which some of Scotland's most celebrated cultural achievements were created by men whose domestic needs these women met invisibly. The merchant families, whose trading relationships with Dutch, French, and German commercial partners brought Edinburgh into European cultural and economic networks that shaped the city's character in ways that history rarely acknowledges, as directly as the individual philosophers and scientists who get credited with the Enlightenment's achievements. The immigrant communities, Flemish craftspeople, Irish laborers, South Asian professionals, refugees from European persecution, whose successive arrivals enriched Edinburgh's cultural diversity and contributed skills, energies, and perspectives that the city could not have produced from its native population alone. The ordinary soldiers who garrisoned Edinburgh Castle through centuries of conflict, whose tours of duty passed largely unrecorded except in occasionally preserved muster rolls. Every great city is ultimately a collective achievement of this kind, built more by anonymous determination than by celebrated genius, shaped more by daily work than by dramatic historical events. One final chapter remains to gather these threads. Long before the first stone walls were raised upon Castle Rock, long before any king claimed Edinburgh as his capital, or any philosopher walked its closes in search of the next transformative idea, a volcano did its slow geological work, forcing hard rock upward through softer stone, creating a formation that millions of years of ice and erosion would then sculpt into the dramatic crag that made everything else possible. The geological accident of Castle Rock's existence determined that a community would occupy this particular location, that a castle would rise upon this particular summit, that a city would extend along this particular ridge, that a capital would eventually establish itself at this particular point on the map of Scotland. From that ancient volcanic event flowed, with the logic of genuine historical causation, the hill forts, the medieval kings, the wars of independence fought over possession of the rock's summit, the royal palace rising at the ridge's eastern end, the explosive intellectual flowering of the Scottish Enlightenment, the Georgian New Town planned on the higher ground to the north, the literary tradition that produced Scott and Stevenson and Conan Doyle, the festival culture that fills August streets with extraordinary human creativity. All of it began with a volcano. All of it was then shaped by generations of human beings, kings and scholars and ordinary citizens whose accumulated choices, ambitions, and daily acts of living created the city that the world now knows as Edinburgh. Its story is still being written with every year that passes, by everyone who lives within it, works beside its ancient stones, and looks up at Castle Rock still commanding the skyline after all these centuries, still the most extraordinary fact in Edinburgh's extraordinary story.